Hi, everyone. This is Derek Harp, the founder and chairman of the Control Systems Cybersecurity Association International, or as we call it, just CSA. CSA is a 501c6 nonprofit workforce development association dedicated to helping grow, support, and sustain the professionals charged with the cybersecurity of control systems. We're specifically talking about those systems that have pumps and valves and actuators, real cyber to physical moving parts, and control nearly every aspect of our modern connected industries. Thank you for tuning into the podcast. It is my hope you find it inspirational or motivating or revealing or informative, and perhaps at times even a little entertaining. Take care and be well. Hey, this is Derek Harp here, the founder and chairman of CSA and the host of the CSA podcast show. And I've got another fantastic guest on the show. I've got Gary Kessler. He is many things. So we'll just say under the umbrella today of Gary Kessler Associates and his company, but he touches a lot of different projects and things and has been involved with so many different things. We'll get to that. He's a former EMT firefighter. He's an outdoorsman. He's a bicyclist. He's a scuba diver. Not only a scuba diver, which everybody knows is near and dear to my heart. He is a fellow master scuba diver trainer. We both have that in common. He is a boat captain. He's a father, a husband, a retired college professor. He is a computer programmer at the beginning of his journey and still today touches that. He's an author with many articles, over 75, I think, and 3 books. So this is a prolific contributor to cybersecurity for many, many, many years. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Derek.
Well, Gary, I have my standard shtick that I always do. Some of these interviews go in different directions, but I always start with the superhero analogy. And every superhero has a backstory, and cybersecurity people are sort of modern day superheroes. So what's your backstory? Where do you come from?
I should start by telling you I was born in a little log cabin in Illinois, but that's probably somebody else's backstory. I grew up in Southern California, LA. My parents actually were living in Westchester, California, which will mean nothing to most anybody, except that in the late 1950s, their house was taken so that they could expand LAX. So the house where I was living when I was born is now somewhere under the north runway of LAX. And we moved to a little town called Los Alamitos, just south of Long Beach. And I went to school in Northern California. I went to Humboldt State. We were so far north in Northern California that I was like 17 or 14 hours away from home and still in California. It's 1,000 miles away or something silly like that. And I got a degree in math. I then started out for my master's in computer science at the University of Arizona. I worked for a year being a computer programmer at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in LA, where I worked in the cardiology department, learned a whole lot about physiology, and then followed my girlfriend to Vermont in 1977, finished up my master's in computer science there. And then eventually, my girlfriend and I split up. I met another woman, we got married, had our children. Went for a few years to California, worked at Lawrence Livermore Lab in the early 80s, and then back to Vermont, since we missed Vermont. And I worked at a data communications training company, teaching datacom primarily to telephone companies. My first wife died of cancer at the 2001. And around 2000, I started teaching at a small college in Vermont, and I was there for 10 years. And a couple of years later, ended up getting a job here at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach. I created the job for myself because I love Vermont. Vermont is a beautiful, wonderful place, and the winters were kicking my ass. And I figured I'd done 36 of these. I've paid my dues. And I'm a boat captain and a scuba instructor and a 5-month season in Vermont. And apparently you can do that year-round in Florida. And I do.
It's about diving in Vermont. I don't know Vermont that well. I'm sure you can. I know from other places you can dive, quote unquote, everywhere in the world, but it's not all the same. And it does get rather cold.
That is true. But if you can dive in Vermont, you can pretty much dive anywhere.
I imagine so.
So I retired from Riddle at the end of 2020. I've been engaged one way or another in, what we now call cybersecurity, now going on, geez Louise, probably about 45 years or so. Took my first computer programming class 50 years ago. So for about the last 6+ years, I've been doing a lot of work related to maritime cybersecurity. So that's where most of my research is. Most of the 10,000 lines of code I've written in the last 5 years have been somewhere around maritime cyber. And the last book I wrote was on maritime cyber. That was my COVID project. In 2020, I co-wrote a book on maritime cyber. Our second edition came out last year. I need to start working on a third version at the end of this year because it's moving fast.
Yeah, and you were a speaker at an event for us, this year, and I remember just some of the bullet points around maritime and sort of major changes in play right now. Bandwidth becoming affordable, which then opens up all kinds of attack surfaces because people are making the connection and saying, "Hey, we can do this and we can do that remotely," and all these sorts of things, which just then makes the threat actors, gleeful about what the things they might be able to do as well. So let's pick apart your journey a little bit. When did cybersecurity, obviously heavy duty, technology and IT and computer science, that goes way back. That's what you were cutting your teeth on. When did security, first pop its head up on that path?
So, people that are in the security business, either physical security or cybersecurity, it doesn't really matter. You sort of have a mindset where you go into a building and you say, wow, if somebody wanted to break into this building, the hinge pins are on the outside of that door, shouldn't they be on the inside? And, you look for cameras and stuff like that. So I took my first computer programming class in 1973, as I said, and I was at a system, we had cards, and I never thought twice about that, although we frequently would observe that if you had a big deck of cards, usually we were putting them in a tray and we would just leave them up in the engineering building so you didn't have to schlep them around all over the place. And it dawns on me in retrospect, I have no idea why we were naive enough to leave the cards there. Nobody ever screwed with them, but I don't know at what point people started becoming a little bit more nervous and paranoid. But then I went to the University of Arizona and we had two systems. One was a time sharing system, it was a DEC 10, and one was a big CDC 7600 on which we also used cards. And unlike my undergraduate school, where you just had your cards for your program, at University of Arizona, your first card was your username, and your second card was your password. And then you have the rest of the program. Well, if you have cards and people can get access to your card deck, why wouldn't they be looking at your username and your password? And so I started gaining a little bit of an interest then. And then I had one of my colleagues in the computer science department demonstrated what we would now call a timing attack against the operating system, where the way the operating system was designed, you had all these cards, right? So you had a username and a password. Well, somebody discovered, it takes, 1,000 milliseconds to determine that the username and the password are correct. And it takes 2,000 milliseconds to pull up the Fortran compiler. And the card right after the username and the password would be identifying what compiler do you want to pull up. So somebody said, well, let's optimize the system. While you're looking for the username and the password, why not start pulling up the Fortran compiler or COBOL or whatever it is you were doing? Because if the password was wrong, then they would just terminate the process. No harm, no foul, right? Well, what this guy discovered was all of this was being done in assembly language. So the third card, instead of calling up the Fortran compiler, would merely call up the Compass assembler, which of course took 0 milliseconds because we're already running the assembler. And then he'd have 8 instructions in which he could crash the computer. So before the computer could figure out what was going on, we'd crash the thing. And so we brought that to the technicians in residence.
Gary, what year is that?
1976.
I think that's critical because you're talking about the like you said, why is this door this way? The light bulbing. I mean, that's as early as anybody's thinking about this. Like,
Well, and to prove that very point, we brought this to the techs. We said, hey, if you do this, this will happen. And they looked and they said, oh, you're right. Well, don't do that because that was cybersecurity in 1976. And then I went to the University of Vermont the next year with my girlfriend, and I discovered, and I won't go into any detail really on this, but I discovered a mechanism that is basically a logon spoofing attack, where what I could do is I could run a program that made it appear that I had just logged out, and then I'd walk away from the terminal. And somebody else would come in and they'd hit the button that they wanted to hit, and they would get a screen that looked like a login screen. and they'd put in their username and their password, and they'd get a message saying, oh, no, that was wrong. And then they'd say, oh, crap, hit the button again. And then they'd put in their username and password. They'd be able to log on and they were fine. Well, what would happen is while I was running my login spoofing program, I was getting their username and their password. And I said, that's not right. And I went to my friend who's in the computer center at the University of Vermont and said, hey, look it, somebody can write a program and do this, that, and the other thing and get people's usernames and passwords. And what did they say?
Don't do that.
Exactly. And I said, okay, I demonstrated my capability, and that's all I wanted to do.
Have we missed a huge opportunity just telling the threat actors, don't do that? Could that have solved all this?
Well, I think they didn't possibly view me as a threat actor. So I've always been underestimated, I suppose, and so I discovered at some point in my career that, and unfortunately, I've gone back to the beginning. At the beginning, I love to write code and I like to implement things. And sometime in the 90s, I realized that I was not as interested in implementing solutions as finding problems and finding a solution to the problems. And once it was clear we had a workable solution, I was happy to let other people actually implement the solution. I wanted to move on to another problem. And so I think my inadvertent and nascent hacking career, there was a lot of that. It was like, gee, this is a good idea. Will it actually work? And then I realized it would actually work. And I would say, okay, well, I'd solved the intellectual challenge. I was not really ever really a cyber criminal or a black hat. And I've, worked in a number of jobs and positions where, I've had an opportunity to hack into things and break things. But I think many of the members of the hacker community today, that's the way they discovered how things worked. And I remember when I was, a baby programmer up at Humboldt State College in the 70s, there were all sorts of people saying, you really want to learn the way the operating system works? Break the computer. And I didn't really know what they were talking about until the first time I broke the computer and said, oh, I just learned a whole lot about the way these devices interact with each other. And so that sort of remained apparently a lifetime interest.
Yeah, and your career is riddled with things. Infraguard Vermont founding president. By the time you get to Embry-Riddle, you eventually become department chair for cybersecurity, for security studies and international affairs. You're teaching cybersecurity at the Home and Defense, security programs. So cybersecurity is all throughout, going back many, many years. When does, and I want to end on talking about the maritime stuff, which definitely has control systems in it, ship control systems, all these sorts of things. How far back with cybersecurity is a long story for you. When does any, operating or control or operating technology converge on your path? And is it maritime? Is that how it first happens, or is there exposure to something before maritime?
No, actually, I would have to say I didn't really start getting into, OT, ICS, whatever but that would all be really in maritime. I've certainly been aware of it, but it wasn't until I started looking seriously at maritime that I realized the integration and the building of cyber physical systems. And I think even the building of cyber physical systems is a relatively new phenomenon, the last 10 or 15 years. So back in my early days, we didn't have any of that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's industry by industry. I served, I see your ball caps up behind you, and I got my ball caps up. If you're, listening to the podcast, you can't see our video, but maybe you'll catch that clip on YouTube. But we both got our ball caps. Are those Coast Guard?
Many of them are. Let's see, a couple of them are police departments where I worked on forensics. And yeah. So,
my ship was a 1972 ship. There wasn't a network, port and starboard networks controlling things, right. and I've seen some of the schematics or designs and discussions on modern ships. So at some point, ships start to be produced, and there are absolutely complicated networks going fore and aft and right. redundancy, port side, starboard side, and all these sorts of things. And so, depending on the plant, depending on the oil refinery, when sort of these newfangled technologies and, IT technology started coming into those spaces varies from company to company. And so some stuff goes back earlier than 10 years, and some companies, they're still quite ancient, even still today, it still works. Don't touch it. Where's the state of maritime as far as information technology being, all up in their business?
Several years ago, there was a a maritime CEO conference where one of the CEOs made the observation that the maritime industry is anywhere from 30 to 500 years behind in technology. And of course, I read that and I laughed. And then I said, what other industry do we have in the world that could be 500 years behind? How many are that old?
Right.
In this case, thousands of years old. But
Yeah.
in many ways, maritime's all over the place. On the one hand, you have companies that still have every device on the same network on the ship, and they haven't even started to segment their networks. And then you have other vessels that are completely autonomous. They're running under AI, they're crewless vessels. I mean, we have a small number of those, but we've had some significant demonstrations in the last few years of, in one case, there was a tug, I think, somewhere in Scandinavia, that circumnavigated the nation. We're starting to see the building of larger vessels to go point to point, port to port around the world. And the fact that we have the technology that will allow a boat to go from a sea buoy to another sea buoy someplace on the open water, that doesn't surprise me at all. It's the building of the boat that then is going from the sea buoy to a dock in brown water. I mean, you don't have a lot of margin of error there. And to me, a similar analogy would be, I can build myself, an 18-wheeler that can get on a freeway and drive autonomously to the exit in which it wants to get off. I mean, on the freeway, there's only a finite number of things that you're going to deal with. Once you hit the exit ramp, the number of things you might have to deal with goes up more than exponentially. And so I trust the 18-wheeler, once it hits exit 368 on I-95, way less than I trust it when it's going from, as I said, exit to exit. So like I said, so in maritime, we're seeing the highest end use of autonomy. By the way, without the highest end use of cybersecurity, but that's a different story. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have vessels that are, difficult to secure.
And this is significantly analogous to all sorts of different manufacturing. And you can just find these modern greenfield being put in, and there's network segmentation and all these things that people talk about. Every security practitioner is talking about a couple of standard things, right? Asset discovery, knowing where everything is, knowing how it's communicating, monitoring those. But let's face it, there's a ton of places that are none of that's going on yet, or very little of it. Ships have to be, maritime has to be, I'm listening to you, it's the same thing. You're going to find a brand new ship. Now, is a brand new ship, is that still going to be also quite diverse? Or, they're making ships, they're all modern and connected?
Well, I would like to believe that all modern ships, if they have modern communications design, should be, coming out of the manufacturing site relatively more secure than some of the older vessels. But, a lot of it has to do with whether
my point was more, I hadn't even jumped to secure. They're all modern networked. Whether they're secure or not, that's where the manufacturer's got the discipline to do it. But are anything new or anything built in the last X years, are those all networked, the port and starboard networks? Is that the way modern ships are made? Or no, there's still a wide variety of ships being made?
There's still a wide variety. I mean, what's coming out of the plant is a boat. And so now the issue is, now I'm going to put on the network. How did I design the network? So they can be wired any old way. Now, I would like to believe that they're using modern techniques, but there's no guarantee of what that modern technique is going to look like.
Well, so that's still the same about equipment manufacturers, not to pull any of them out, but the whole group, Yokogawa, Siemens, ABB, Rockwell, they're all at different stages and different maturities. And so that's the same thing then for boat builders. They're not all building the same sort of craft. Are there some saying, we get it, we're going to make secure ships, even part of their brand? Is anybody doing that yet?
I believe that there's certainly some, and those are the same companies, I believe, that have a pretty good cyber safety culture within their own organization, and certainly that ripples from the organization all the way down to the vessels. But those are also some of the bigger organizations, and so it's unclear when I read who's got what profit margin in maritime. I mean, sometimes I read, oh yeah, they're doing great, and other times it's like they're making $1 per container. some of the smaller companies are hurting a little bit more than the bigger companies. Even so, some of the bigger companies are getting whacked all the time. We've had a couple of the bigger companies that have actually been fined because, if you have a cyber incident that causes loss of customer information, employee information, PII, PHI, what have you, okay, that can happen. When it happens 2 or 3 times in a matter of 2 or 3 years, that smacks of a company that maybe is not doing its due diligence. And that's when government agencies and regulators start to step in and say, okay, we think you need to get a fine.
Yeah.
But you're not fixing it.
So when did your cybersecurity, your technology path, then cybersecurity becomes the main theme in your life? Maritime was a personal thing, right? Being a boat captain, that goes back away. That's your personal passion area, right?
Well, I grew up, in Southern California. I grew up on the water. Didn't know many people who owned boats, so I didn't spend a lot of time on boats. When I moved to Vermont, Vermont's body of water is Lake Champlain, a very large freshwater lake. It is the 6th largest lake in the United States. For a while in the 90s, it was a Great Lake. Don't remember that, do you? Yes, for a very short period of time, we had 6 Great Lakes.
Oh, wow.
It was all political. You may be familiar with zebra mussels.
Yes.
Zebra mussels are an invasive species. They were introduced probably by a foreign vessel in the Great Lakes. It eventually got down to Lake Champlain.
Coming up through the St. Lawrence Seaway and
coming down. Yeah, coming down.
Yeah.
The University of Vermont wanted some money to do some study about the zebra mussels in Lake Champlain. And we're told, well, no, there's National Science Foundation money for zebra mussel investigation in the Great Lakes. And Pat Leahy, senior senator from Vermont at the time, said, well, can you cut them some money? Oh, no, this is only for the Great Lakes. So Pat did what politicians do. And so Vermont became a Great Lake so that UVM could get some research funds. And then finally, everybody said, okay, listen, why don't we just rename the grant for the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain and put the books back to where they were. And now everybody can just remember HOMES as the acronym for the Great Lakes, and they don't have to figure out, how do we get that C in there? So in any case, yes, for a short period of time in the early 90s, Lake Champlain was a Great Lake. In any case, so I started doing boating and diving in Lake Champlain. I got my first boat actually a little over 30 years ago. And I love being in, on, and under the water. And in fact, I would observe that probably around 2016 or so, I was realizing, I'm going to be 65 in a couple of years. And I had to think that at some point I want to retire, spend a lot of time on a dive boat. And then I discovered maritime cyber. Said, oh my God, this pulls together like everything except music, everything for which I have passion. And it was really interesting stuff too.
So what's your first nexus for cybersecurity and maritime? What's the first project or thing that draws those two together for you? Because now it seems like that's a lot. I mean, that's when I see what you're speaking and writing on, and certainly what you spoke on one of our panels on, your maritime and cybersecurity are married for you. And that's a huge new, for me, for CSA, that's like one of these exciting verticals. We got a bunch of these verticals, and maritime's a whole exciting vertical that you're focused on. I mean, what was that spark?
So I actually discovered maritime so first, I'm at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University.
Yeah.
They all find out I'm a captain. They're very excited. Then, you're a sea captain. Well, okay. So then they're not impressed. I was asked to put together a talk on aviation cybersecurity in mid-2017. And amazingly, I knew very little about aviation cyber. Nobody was talking about aviation cyber, 6-7 years ago. And so I'm putting together this talk. And while putting together the talk, I discovered 2 things. One, I accidentally stumbled upon a talk about maritime cyber. And then I looked at the system of systems. And I said, well, wait a minute. I got ships, I've got airplanes. I've got shipping lines, I've got airlines. I've got ports, I've got airports. I've got cargo, I've got people. And I realized that, wow, I mean, word for word, I could practically substitute one set of problems for another. So I put together the talk on aviation cyber. And then I realized that as really cool as that was, I really liked the maritime cyber. I used to think that aviation was in trouble cybersecurity wise. And then I met maritime. and said, oh, they're really in a mess. And when I did some of my reading, one of the early research papers I stumbled upon was some work that was done by Marco Balduzzi and his team at Trend Micro about some of the security problems with the automatic identification system with AIS. And it just intrigued me. And so from a research perspective, that was that little rat hole that I followed. But I've attempted to maintain being a generalist in maritime cyber. If you can be a generalist in a specialty, I've tried to, be a generalist in maritime cyber, since then. And yeah, so I think that answered your question or tap danced around it or something.
No, it totally did. Yeah, where that spark, of your stuff converging, right? Things you had already, different parts of you converged in one place. So I know people, this is sort of the questions. Can someone hack a ship and change the rudder? They're thinking these big things. Obviously, could you get information about shipping schedules? Not PII, but like content, right? Data that's valuable. And I think people could wrap their head around that. Then knowing where the ship's going to be and all that. But when you talk about cyber to physical systems, you're like, well, now we're talking about can you cause harm, bodily harm to people on the ship or to people near the ship? What's the reality or not of that picture?
It's hard trying to convince people of a reality when something hasn't happened before. Yeah. And amazingly, you'd be surprised at how many people in the maritime industry I talk to who we'll talk about potential things. They'll say, yeah, but if that was potential, somebody would have done it by now. And but ignoring that mindset for a second, there are any number of things actually that could be done to a vessel that could be harmful. And I'll give you a couple of innocuous examples. In early 22, I think, maybe it's 21, there was a vessel off the coast of Japan that lost power. It lost power because the oil sensor indicated low oil pressure. It caused the engine, because of course modern vessels only have one engine, caused the engine to shut down because it wanted to prevent itself from seizing up, right? It took the crew 4 minutes to realize why the engine shut down and that the oil pressure was fine and get the engine restarted again. In those 4 minutes, the vessel lost 2% of its cargo overboard. So when that happened, I observed, okay, this was not a cyber attack. I mean, that was legitimate failure. And then it dawned on me, well, if I were to take a rogue device and put it on the ship and monitor the gyroscope and wait until I detect a high level of pitch, roll, and yaw, indicating bad weather, and now I'm going to pretend to be the oil sensor, and I'm going to send out information indicating low oil pressure. Now, the oil sensor might be sending out a message once every, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 5 seconds, doesn't matter. I'm sending out 100 per second. I'm going to overwhelm any good news by showing bad news. Could I damage a vessel that way? Vessels having lost power can have catastrophic results. The end of 22, I believe, there was a Thai warship that sank after losing power, taking a little bit of water on board, which merely exacerbated the electrical problems. More water on board. They couldn't get the pumps. They couldn't get rescue from other vessels because of rough seas. And, they lost the ship and they lost many sailors. There are all sorts of example doomsday scenarios. Vessels, that same rogue device, rather than wait for the gyroscope to show me bad weather, how about monitor the GPS location and wait until I am in a critical, read that as a narrow channel, Kill Van Kull, Suez, Panama, you name it. And as soon as I indicate that I'm, within some region, GPS wise, pull the rudder hard over, up the throttle. And I've seen any number of these scenarios where the people on board the vessel, they're going to know something's going wrong, but it takes a few seconds to really understand that something's going wrong. And then you correct it the way you normally would. You turn the rudder, but the rudder's not responding. You pull back on the throttle, but the throttle's not responding. Because everything on a ship now, as you know, in the old days when we were kids, you push on the throttle and there's a cable somewhere. Well, there's no longer a cable. Everything's been fly-by-wire for, depending on where you are, 20 to 40 years.
We ordered up as a ship's officer, we'd order up the change in course or speed up in the pilot house, and then it would
Yep.
like reflect down there, and they would make changes in the plans.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so today, with everything being fly by wire, I can put devices to be sitting in the middle of what's going on at the bridge and what's going on in the engineering station.
There's so many threads I want to pull here. I mean, one, I want to joke and say, oh, but that would require some sort of disgruntled insider. Oh, wait, the number one threat actor in our annual reports, the winner is absolutely insiders.
That's right.
So I'm joking. Of course, they could get access, even if it wasn't an insider. There's ways, right, in the shipyard
right.
or here or there.
Well, disgruntled insiders are probably more of a threat in an organization where you have people that are happily working where they're working.
Yeah.
In maritime, you have a lot of cases where the bridge crew and the officers have to become more and more technologically aware than ever, because, I mean, look at what they're driving now. And yet you have many crew members who, we're beyond the days of people being shanghaied, at least, shanghaied by pulling them on a bar on the Barbary Coast. But many of them, it's a hard life being paid very, very poor wages and being away from home for 6 months.
Yeah.
It's real easy to possibly subvert one of those type of individuals.
Yeah.
And now, not to mention the fact boats stop at ports and maintenance people are getting on the boat, and some ports have better security about who's getting on and what they're doing than others.
For sure. Yeah. The possibilities that the attack surfaces, like all of our surfaces, they're multiplying. And that brings me to something that a colleague of yours in the industry was sharing with me around the time you were doing an event with us. I was talking to somebody else, and he said, we're at a seismic shift for this. So anybody saying this is the way, some sort of static look at the last 30 years, and there hasn't been an incident, this sort of mindset. He said, we're now with the huge drop in bandwidth cost to ships. There's going to be an exponential, or is, I guess, an exponential rise in connectivity to the ship and new use cases. Well, we can adjust this from here. We can monitor that. The ship owners, operators, the global concerns want to do things to their ship potentially from far away. That's going to blow up because it was so expensive. I forget the number, like $10,000 a month for a good connection. And that's going to be now below $1,000 a month, and so a lot more people are going to be able to afford the connections.
Well, more and more shipping lines are now also hooking onto Starlink.
Yeah, and, I think that's what he was talking about.
Yeah, because of that very thing. So, a couple things always come to mind with this. This is perhaps a poor time in history to re-invoke 9/11. But I remember being with some cop buddies of mine right after 9/11. This would have been sometime in 2002, talking about some security issues with somebody who said, if that was possible, it would have happened already. And one of my colleagues said, for the last 100 years, you've been able to fly planes into buildings. Nobody did it until last September.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that the vulnerability does not exist. It means that nobody has yet chosen to exploit it.
Yeah.
And so I haven't referred to the rate of change in technology for at least 15 years. I've been talking about the acceleration of change. It is going so much faster than we can necessarily comprehend. You alluded to a little bit about autonomous vessels. So using autonomous vessels as an example, any boat that's on the water, particularly if there's a commercial person behind it, we're all subject to the collision regulations. And these are the rules of the road. Well, one of the rules on the road is you maintain a good lookout. Well, how am I doing that on an autonomous crewless vessel? Well, clearly I'm going to do that with a whole boatload, no pun intended, of cameras. And the cameras now need to be connected someplace, right? So the bridge of the future is going to look like my office while I'm drinking coffee and I'm, monitoring the camera on this vessel.
Yeah.
It's naive to believe that nobody's going to be able to break into that signal. And I don't care how much encryption you have and how much VPN you have. It's naive to believe that that is immune from attack. So, we hadn't started to talk about this yet, but, while autonomy is a huge area of research, I'm surprised at how few papers I have seen on ways to secure autonomous vessels.
Yeah, there needs to be more, going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, more, why are the hinges on the outside of the door? I mean, that level of inquisitiveness right now.
Yep.
Okay, we're looking at all these new technologies and new applications, and I'm generally for a lot of that. I mean, I like innovation. However, can we do it? Can we have secure by design? Can security be
Right.
part of the engineering of this from day one, not retrofitting it, which we're forced to do today?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. Oh, rats. What was the name of the submersible that got?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
recently,
So
yeah.
yeah. Well, the guy who owned that company was very big about we're trying to avoid regulation. Regulation stops innovation. And I'm not convinced that that's true. Regulation can be strangling. I get that. But it is clear that unfettered work without some level of oversight and or thought can also be catastrophic.
Yeah, I was trying to look up the name of it. It's gotten
I
so
want to say
much.
Deep Quest or something, but that
Yeah,
sounds like it can't be
yeah.
right.
I'm finding all kinds of news on it, but they're not naming it. Ocean Gate was the company, the Titan submersible.
Yeah, that's it. Yes, the Titan submersible.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's fine line, right? I think there's more than one sort of questioning, like, who really held up the idea of fail fast, and I forget the other terms for just like go so fast, it's okay, there's failure, but that's where all the exciting stuff happens. And they're like, there's a hidden cost to all that. I'm becoming a big believer. It's like we've got a lot of brownfield stuff from ships to oil refineries that we got to
Yep.
retrofit what we can, right? You got to deal with what the reality of the assets you have. But man, oh man, let's not make new stuff that just is inherently not even, it doesn't have any smart security engineering even involved in the process.
Yep. Well, and that goes back. You've already mentioned this, and I sort of started to mention this earlier. Is this whole idea of secure by design? When you build a system, think about how you're going to secure it. So, and actually that goes back a little bit to my background. My background academically is mathematics and computer science. So this is more or less I have a little bit of an engineering mindset, and there's an adage that I was introduced to many years ago that basically said that engineers don't understand security. We live in solution space, not problem space. So, you tell me that you want a way of purifying water. Okay, we're engineers. We're going to come up with a way of purifying water. What we're not going to do is come up, how could somebody taint the water that we are purifying? And so when it comes to thinking about systems, information systems for which there could be attack, we build in all sorts of resiliency, right? But we're building in resiliency without understanding who our enemy is. We think our enemy is nature. I understand nature stochastically. I can figure out statistically what are my mean times to failure, what are my mean times to repair, all that kind of stuff, and build around that. We're not necessarily resilient to human attack. And I think I mentioned this in the presentation that I gave to you, although there are many examples, but I probably used the GPS example. I mean, GPS is designed to be resilient when a satellite fails. We merely move it out and we move a new one in, and we have spares up there because we understand, I need 24 working satellites. I've got 30, I've got plenty of spares. What we're not used to or not ready for is what happens if we have an adversary. Vladimir Putin leaps to mind, who says, I'm going to knock down all your GPS satellites at once. And I've got the anti-satellite technology to do it. And I've demonstrated that it works. Then what do we do? And that's a different level of resiliency that we as a society need to deal with.
Yeah, that's I'm just shudder when I think about the impacts of a system like that and how reliant so many things are on it. Yeah, that is great cautionary words there around the things we have designed or worked to perfect around.
Yeah.
Storms, weather, natural disaster. Lots of people know a lot about that. Like now we have to factor in this very real human-led thing. And I'm not a fear, uncertainty, and doubt seller. I like your analogy to say just because it hasn't been done. I do think risk measurement is becoming a nice scientific approach, and in likelihood is part of the equation. Sure, it should be. Of a highly exotic but disastrous thing. I mean, you might not spend billions of dollars to protect against that, but something that's got a decent likelihood and a decent impact to human beings, we probably ought to be addressing that.
So, back in the early 60s, there was a major power failure in New York. And not only was there a baby boom soon thereafter, But apparently, I read a book many, many years ago, and it has obviously left an impression upon me, talking about the fact that there were people who were stuck in elevators. There was no panic. And there was no panic because people were saying, oh, crap, I'm stuck in an elevator. But I know that people know we're here and they're going to get us out. And so knowing that, there was, not really widespread panic. So yesterday, I was at the post office, and there were just a few of us in the building. And one of the people who was in the building said, hey, does anybody here have Verizon? I can't get my phone to work. And I looked, and sure enough, I had no connectivity of any sort. Okay, 5-10 minutes later, I leave. I go to call my wife. I can't get her because I have no service. All right, well, I was going to a store that was down the road. I didn't know exactly where it was. And I, go to maps on my phone. But of course, that's not going to work. Now, is it? Because I had no connectivity.
Yeah.
I went without connectivity for somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. And all this time, I've got all these scenarios. Let's see. I should call my wife to tell her, oh, I can't do that until I get home or I get to my office.
Yeah.
Oh, crap. My office, I have a desk phone, but how am I going to call her? She has a cell phone. And when I finally got a hold of her, she hadn't been using her phone for the previous 45 minutes. She didn't know there was a problem.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here going through all the stuff I can't do.
Yeah. That we take for granted.
Absolutely. Don't even think twice.
The next generation, younger, definitely doesn't think about it. It's always been there. I was thinking in my head, why didn't you reach in the glove compartment for a paper map? Or go to the local payphone. Oh, right. They're not anywhere.
That's right. I still have maps and I can still read them, but that's because I'm a map and chart weenie. Look over my shoulder,
Those nautical charts. That's a beach somewhere, right? That's coastal, isn't it?
That is very coastal. That is our local intracoastal waterway. But I teach charting and plotting and navigation, and I love it. Now, partially because I'm a mathematician and partially because I'm a chart weenie. But the fact of the matter is what I really need to teach people is how to use their GPS. And that is much harder. But also, when they do something on the GPS, I want them to know how to chart and plot on a paper chart so that they have a fighting chance of knowing when they're getting a totally wrong answer.
Yeah.
And yet, what is the trend? The trend is to get rid of paper charts. NOAA wants to have paper charts gone by 2025.
Sure. Yeah.
And everything will be electronic chart. And we've already seen problems in maritime with inaccurate paper charts or an over-reliance on our tools and not a seaman's eye. And yet, in aviation, they will tell you, don't trust your senses, trust your instruments, because the air can screw up your senses. You may think you're flying level, look at the artificial horizon on the instrument panel. And if they disagree, fly the instrument. Whereas on the water, it's frequently use a seaman's eye, is where the GPS is telling you, does that make sense? It says you're next to a green buoy. You look outside, you're next to a red buoy. Trust the fact that you're next to a red buoy.
Yeah.
Act accordingly.
Two sort of anecdotal stories came to mind. I was told that in the mid 90s, I was one of the last class of new Navy officers that learned about Loran Charlie and shot sun lines. They made me do all that. When I got to my first ship, it's like, you got to do all this stuff. And I'd heard that was dispensed with and just rely on the GPS. And I always wondered about that. And I've heard that maybe some of those skills have come back to future generations because somebody did say,
Navy brought sections back in 2015.
Okay.
I remember actually very specifically the meeting I went to where the Navy ROTC commander told me about that. And we both agreed it was not because the Navy was going back to their love and lore of the ocean. It was more like, the Admiral would like to know roughly vaguely where in the North Atlantic are we? But Loran C was shut off in 2010 or thereabouts.
Oh, okay. I left the service in 1997, so Loran C was still in play. But it's a fun analogy, scary, whatever. These reliance on systems, eliminating older systems, paper, and going more and more in the electronic realm. Our whole world, everything is doing, not just maritime, everything's doing that. Then we become reliant on it. Then we become more and more vulnerable to other human beings, and that's the state of play.
And the fact is, I ride my bike several times a week, and I have an app on my phone to track my ride. Again, I'm a map weenie, right? And there are days where my map, my ride, map my ride app can show me being on this side of the street or that side of the street. And there are other days where I'll be riding and the map will show me riding right through somebody's house.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact is that all this technology really is cool. It is amazing what we can do and what you and I have seen changes in our lifetime. And it works almost perfectly when nobody's screwing with it. We
Yeah.
didn't build any of this stuff with the mind that somebody's going to screw with it. I remember when I first got on a relative of the internet. I started using the ARPANET in 1981 when I was at Livermore. And then when I left and went back to Vermont, I was working at I was an adjunct professor at a school that was on a different network called the BitNet. And BitNet and the CSNet, they could all, talk via the internet. We could send emails and stuff like that. And it was so cool, but we were such a closed group. Nobody in the ARPANET community was going to screw around with the ARPANET. Why? That wasn't the point. We were all trying to build something. And it wasn't until we met commercialization and let everybody play with these networks that we had built that, okay, modern society, crept in, something else that we wanted to build for universal peace. Do you know the guy who in many ways is credited with the whole idea of having this global network? This guy named J.C. Licklider.
No, I don't know that name. I was going to picture that I would know the name when you said it, but.
So, I mean, you hear names like Kleinrock, who basically invented packet switching, but J.C.R. Licklider in the early 60s, he's a psychologist who came up with this idea of an intergalactic connected network where people could communicate directly with each other unfettered by geopolitical boundaries. Now, isn't that the coolest idea in the world? And he had that idea before any of that technology existed. And then, of course, we built the networks that we have today. And the internet provides us what Licklider, thought would be a good idea. And it is a good idea when you only have people involved and you get governments out of the way. But then you have what we've now seen for the last 5 or 6 years is any idiot can publish, and they do. And they can say whatever the hell they want. And we don't have people that are critical enough thinkers to be able to say, this source has credibility. That source does not. And we have enabled that old adage about a lie can make it 8 times around the world before the truth even gets out of bed.
Yeah.
So
we're in a different age now on information and quality and what's real and what's not and all that sort of thing. Well, Gary, I think this has been beyond fascinating. There's so many threads we could pull, but I've been told that the 4-hour podcast just isn't a thing. So I got to say thank you very much for not only coming on the show and being on our live shows on Wednesdays at 1 this year. We didn't know each other before that, and so I really appreciate you responding to my reach out. I'm glad we're now connected, and this is a fascinating vertical, especially for me with my background. It's really fascinating to see what you're doing and what's happening there. So I look forward to future discussions with you, and thank you for your service to our country in many ways.
No, thank you.
Well, we're at that time of the show where I like to end with the same sort of fun thing that I've borrowed from another show, which they borrowed from another show. So it's called the Pivot Questionnaire. I got it from watching episodes of Inside the Actors Studio for many years off and on. And the host, the long time host of that show, James Lipton, would interview all the famous actors and actresses, but he always ended the show with this unique questionnaire that he called the Pivot Questionnaire. So when I looked into it, he borrowed it from a French show. And so I've not changed a word of it. And if you're up for it, we'll end our time together with the Pivot Questionnaire.
Sure.
All right. What is your favorite word?
There's something about having knee-jerk reactions to things. I've never thought in terms of having a favorite word, but somehow I interpret your question as concept, and I've many. I think my top favorite word would be friendship.
What is your least favorite word?
Whatever word has the following definition. We've always done it that way. So I guess that would be sloth.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Curiosity.
What turns you off?
whatever word translates to the meaning of we've always done it that way. I guess that would be sloth.
What is your favorite curse word?
Well, I will admit I sort of lean towards the F word, but that reminds me of a story. Can I tell you a story? When my son was very young, 2, 3, one day he was doing something and I was reading, and he had trouble getting something done. He said, "Oh shit!" And then he looked at me and I said, "Joshua, listen, I know sometimes say stuff like that may make you feel better for a moment. Do not let your mother hear you say that." And she said, "But Dad, I heard that from Mom." And then I remembered I use the F word. She uses the S word. I said, "Joshua, you're coming right with me to talk to your mother." And so, yeah, but anyway.
What sound or noise do you love?
I drive an eco tour boat every Friday night. I've been doing that now for about 8.5 years. My favorite noise is hearing a dolphin blowhole.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Well, it's somewhere between fingernails on a chalkboard, loud mufflers.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I don't live having doubts or having regrets in my life. For any number of reasons, I never entered the military. I'm in the Coast Guard Auxiliary now, been that for many, many years, and I've taught at the Coast Guard Academy. One of my life alternative paths was to have gone into the Coast Guard or the Navy. And sometimes I think I wish I had.
What profession would you not like to do?
I don't think I would like any profession where I wasn't allowed the freedom to think and do stuff differently. That's a sort of wide field. I've never really thought about professions I wouldn't like. I don't think I would be happy collecting trash or asking people if they want fries with their hamburger. I don't think I would find them fulfilling.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Rats. Can't think of his name. There was a famous philosopher who said if I found that to be the case, I would ask God, where's the evidence? I don't think I would have the temerity to ask God to explain stuff. I think he's got a lot, he or she has a lot of splaining to do. Yeah, I guess the only answer would be, like, why?
All right. I've just wrapped up another super interesting episode of the CSA podcast with Gary Kessler. Gary Kessler, president of Gary Kessler Associates, but man of many, many projects and associations and organizations. And thank you so much for coming on the show and for all your years of service to us all. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks for having me, Derek.
Take care. Bye-bye.